Corporation, RF Communications Division, in cooperation with the Antique Wireless Association Incorporated, presents a tour of the Antique Wireless Association Electronic Communication Museum. Bruce, I'm interested in artifacts of the history of radio communications.
Well, Chuck, I think we have just what you're looking for in this old building. It's, by the way, the building was put up in 1837. What do you think of that?
Wow.
The radio equipment doesn't go back to 1837, however.
Not.
Come on in.
Okay. Bruce, can you tell me a little bit about the museum in general before we start looking at details?
Well, Chuck, the fellows have got a wide variety of equipment here. As you know, it's a group operation. We're volunteers, and they've just brought in about anything associated with communication. This showcase, for an example, is full of early camera television tubes, going right back to the very beginning. The upper shelf, one can see early orthicons. On the lower shelf, one can see different varieties of the iconoscope. There's also a Farnsworth dissector tube, which is quite rare. All of these tubes were made in the 1930s. Now, over on the far right, the lower right, you see rather an awkward-looking piece of equipment with a large white card. Now, that supposedly is the first portable television camera. We're told that prior to the development of this camera, it was necessary to carry portable or field equipment on a large 10-ton truck. This camera was made by RCA, and as you can see, it's quite portable. And as I say, it's a wide variety. We just seem to hit little of everything. An old ship receiver, for an example. It's a Marconi, made over in Canada, about 1914. Here, well, it's quite obvious. These are tubes, transmitting tubes primarily. Altogether, the association has about 7,000. What we're looking at over here is a collection of early transmitting tubes. Note that every tube starts with the number 800. Actually, we have about 7,000 tubes in our collection, but we wanted something representative of the transmitting line since we have many engineers visit our museum. So we selected the 800 series. Some of these tubes are over 50 years old. Some of them are relatively modern. I say modern in the last 10 years. They don't use tubes as much as they used to. The tube on the end is quite interesting. That was used in a television transmitter. Can you read that there, Chuck?
Yeah, RCA Type 899 used in a television transmitter at the Empire State Building in 1939 during the World's Fair.
Believe it or not, that was considered a VHF tube. Look at the size. And you can imagine the inter-electrode capacity.
Looks like it was water-cooled, too.
That is correct. That's where the water went in and went out again. They connected hoses. This, Chuck, is one of the very, very first tubes ever made. We're talking about 1905, 1906. This is known as a Fleming valve. Really, all it is a diode. But it's the granddaddy of the modern vacuum tube. Just a diode is developed over in England. Mm-hmm. And in a very short time, Dr. Lee DeForest added another element to the tube, namely the grid. Now, this tube could not amplify, it could not oscillate. By adding the grid to the tube, we now have, you might say, a modern tube. You could amplify with it, you could use it as a detector, as an oscillator, or as a matter of fact, any part of the transmitter. And the triode played an important part well into the 30s before they started to add the other elements to the tube. And this, again, is a DeForest triode. This particular tube, I think it was made about 1910, and again, the Fleming valve is 1905, 1906 possibly. Now, yes, over here, is a receiver that uses one of these DeForest audions. Very crude. There wasn't much to it. There's a tuning section that is attached over to this side of it. How do you like that?
Wow.
Don't drop it.
I
Very
wouldn't think
rare.
of it.
Very rare.
Patented 1908.
Yeah.
And what is the potentiometer for on the
Well, actually,
sound?
it's not a potentiometer. It's a rheostat. And that controlled the amount of voltage which lights the tube. You know, these early tubes almost look like light bulbs, don't they? You know,
Yes.
see the little candle brown base there? Looks like a light bulb. You know, as a matter of fact, they would light up quite brilliantly.
Excellent. Thank you.
Over here, I think you can relate a little more to this. We have really crystal set receivers, you know, back in the early 1920s. And people like to look back, reminisce in the early days. Here, most people overlook what we have here, Chuck. This is very early Marconi equipment that was contemporary with the Titanic when it sunk in 1912. The exact equipment that would have been on the Titanic, transmitter and receiver. Here, this is interesting. These are early measuring instruments. Some of these pieces date back to as early as 1820, 1830. People working in laboratories or for large industrial companies, they could find much interest in some of these very early measuring galvanometers and so on. Very crude, very crude. Here we have Atwater Kent receivers, and these are broadcast sets of the 20s.
They were very popular, weren't they?
Oh, indeed they were, and they're made on a board, breadboard. They actually call them Atwater Kent breadboards. They're very pretty, and the collectors are really after those sets, if they can find one, of course. And in here is the very beginning of communication. This is Telegraph. Telegraph, of course, started in the 1840s, 1850s, and some of our equipment in here actually dates 1840, 1850. Of course, you immediately associate telegraphy, landline with Samuel F.B. Morse.
Of course.
And I'll show you more about these pieces later on. Let us go back in here and look at some of these early forms of entertainment. I think if we go in chronological order, this is the oldest. This is an early Edison phonograph, Chuck, and the records are unlike anything you know of today. They're round, see that?
Oh.
And round cylinders. Actually, Edison started making these back in the late 1880s, 1890. And this particular phonograph, we have it dated as 1905. Would you like to listen to it?
Oh, I'd be delighted.
Well,
really.
let's see if I can get the darn thing going again here.
Maybe if I stood
You better
over
go over there and listen
here.
now.
Okay.
Well, Chuck, that was hi-fi 75 years ago.
It really sounded like hi-fi.
You want to remember, though, that this time we didn't have radio, we didn't have television. This was really something to have in the home. Now, after this type of phonograph, we came in with the more modern type, where you have a flat disc. You know, see the modern type of record.
Oh, yes, I've
and of
seen
course,
that.
we associate that with the famous RCA Victor logo or whatever here of Nipper. Nipper, by the way, is a British dog. The Victor Company bought the rights to this dog for their trademark from England, about 1905, 1910. So Nipper is really a British dog. Now, let's get down to entertainment as we know it, at least today in a sense. We have here television that was about 50 years ago. Really, the spinning disc type came in 1927, 1928. And we're very fortunate to have these on demonstration. Of course, you won't see any pictures because we don't have stations that would send out signals for this type. Essentially, the spinning disc television receiver is a spiral of holes. Now, this particular one here, I don't know if you can see it in there, but there are 24 holes. That means you have 24 lines.
I see the line going up from bottom to top, yes.
And every revolution, you have one of the holes in a different position because it is a spiral. But with only 24 holes, believe me, you didn't see much of a picture. This is a little better, this one over here. This has 60 holes. This is a drum type, and that's right, you look in there, there's a magnifying glass. The picture actually is only about, 3/4 of an inch high.
Looks more like a shadow show than anything else.
That's right. Early television was pretty much a black and white Mickey Mouse type, where you have either black or white subject. And you're very fortunate even to see a picture. I have a friend who tells me he had a set like this and he waited 3 months before he saw his first picture. They only went on about once a week for about an hour, some of the early stations. Now, I like to jump right over here because in one great sweep, we went from the 1930 to 1935, 36. And this is a modern set in the sense that it uses a cathode ray tube like we have in our sets at home now.
That would be a big improvement.
Oh, indeed. But it was a little crude because you're wondering where the picture is, aren't you? Well, I'll show you where the picture is. Sure, it's right here. You have to look into the mirror down at the tube. Why? Because the neck of the tube is about so long. It's so long that the only way they could mount the tube is to mount it vertically. You look into the mirror down at the picture. Now, this was a vast improvement over that type with the spinning disc. Here we have 343 lines. So you really had fairly good definition.
Much better than 24.
That's for sure. By the late 30s, however, they were up to 425 and eventually 525. Your modern television, as you know, is 525 lines. After the war, television became popular, and this is a typical receiver of that period. They had to mass produce them, keep costs down, so the screens were very small. That's a 3-inch pilot. And do I have to tell you what you're looking at?
Magnifying lens.
That's for sure. And what they would do, of course, is to place this in front of the picture, and that would give you a little larger picture. It was crude, but it was a way of having a larger picture. After all, imagine 4, 5, 6 people in the living room all sitting around trying to see that small picture. So it was a means to an end. While we're here, I'd like to show you the first color. The first color, one of the first colors, was spinning disc. Again, we have the three, your primary colors. And this is sort of a crude arrangement, really, but it worked. And again, it's mechanical because as you can see in there, see, Chuck?
Yes.
Yeah, they're the same disc. And
what did you do with this disc?
Well, you placed it in front of a black and white set. And again, the trick is to make it spin exactly the right speed. Now, when that's spinning at the right speed, you get beautiful color.
Sounds like it ought to be noisy.
Well, it was noisy. And if you wanted a larger picture, you had to have a larger disc. I could visualize the disc, say, 5, 6 feet in diameter. Well, that wouldn't be very practical in the home. I might add, this was CBS approach to color TV. It was short-lived. I think it was 1952, 53, 54 when they were developing this. But we know what happened. They went in favor of electronic color scanning. So, however, it does fit a pattern in what we're trying to do here, to show the development of radio television. Here's a set I'm very proud of, and any collector would be too. It's a Scott. If you're a collector, you recognize immediately the Art Deco effect. This set here is 1932. It makes it about 50 years old. It's a beautiful receiver, And most people say immediately, hey,
Where's the cover?
where's the cover? There never was a cover.
Did you lose it?
No, it was so pretty that the company that made the set was Scott. They decided to leave the cover off. How about that?
Wow.
And I like to turn it on. It's going to take about a half a second here for the tubes to warm up. You know, your modern sets today, you know, you just flip the switch and you got music instantly. But this one here, you have to heat up. And it's amazing the quality and the tone on a set 50 years old. It only has one speaker, no tweeters or woofers as we know today. Now let's see if we can find something here. Doesn't sound too bad, does it?
I'll take one, Bruce.
You'll take one.
Sure.
Be surprised what you'd have to pay for a set like this. Most console radios are not too valuable. You know, they're plentiful. Who wants one? But this is what we call a classic. Any set like this of the 30s is known as a classic. This is a classic. And I think the museum is very fortunate to have one like this.
What's the rack of the equipment here?
Oh, well, believe it or not.
How does that fit in all
That
this?
fits in. That's a very, very early broadcast transmitter, about 1922, 1923. And broadcasting was in its infancy. You want to remember now, broadcasting, we think of KDKA, the early stations, 1921, 1922. Well, that is of that period. That's the Western Electric rack. Chuck, come in this room. This is a little different. We're in a 1925 radio store. If you went into a store in 1925, the mid-20s, this is what you would see. Showcases full of the parts. It's very popular, by the way, to build your own receiver. And people would buy these parts and make the sets, you know. However, the more fluent people, if you had the money, you would buy a set. And these are typical receivers of that period.
There's quite a variety here.
Of course, they still had many, many knobs, tuning knobs, dials, and so on. I tried to have some of them in operation. As a matter of fact, we have one right here that works. All of these sets use batteries. You had a storage battery to light the filaments, and of course you had to have what we call B batteries for the plate supply. And I don't have to tell you that this is a modern piece of equipment. This replaces the batteries. And this is a set of just about 1925. It's an Atwater Kent.
Oh, it's also built on a board.
That's a breadboard. Now, let's hold our breath and see if we can get some music or something on this.
Oh, great.
Yeah, here's something. You know, it's necessary to tune all these dials to... It's coming out of that horn speaker, of course.
Oh, it's got a speaker.
Yeah. Try to compare this
Not
with a
too bad.
modern broadcast set. You know, the modern set, you can get a little pocket radio. You can just slip in your pocket there. It's
Be
so
nice.
small. Sure. Yeah.
What's this set over here with all the little assemblies?
Oh, well, that is a real early set of the 20s. That's about 1920, as a matter of fact. And obviously, it's 3 tubes.
Who made it?
DeForest, the DeForest Company. And modules. You'd buy the modules and you assemble it into this panel and wire it up in the back, and you'd have a 3-tube set.
Could you buy fewer modules and have a less sophisticated
That is
radio?
correct.
Very nice.
This is really a collector's item, and it's selling for about $1,500. So just be glad that you are not collecting old broadcast sets. That's all I can say. The equipment you see here precedes radio by many years. Landline telegraphy started way back in 1840, 1850. And many of these instruments, sounders, relays, and so on, were all made back in the 1800s. What we have right over here is a telegraph station of about 1910. And if I remember my code, I'm going to sit down here, I'm going to send my name. And this is the way it sounded. The sounder's up there, and this is what it sounded like. That was my name, Bruce. And a station like this was very common. When, as a matter of fact, we found a telegraph station in every railroad station. And of course, a lot of people associate the sounders and the relays and this sort of thing with Western Union. Very common in the old days. However, this sort of thing is completely phased out today. You just don't have telegraph operators anymore.
Where did the name Western Union come from?
Well, Western Union was the formation of many telegraph companies way back in the 1870s, I believe, by Ezra Cornell of Cornell University and a fellow by the name of Hiram Sibley. And they bought up many of these small independents and made one large company and combined them all, which enabled one to send a telegram from, say, Rochester all the way to Chicago through one company. Heretofore, it was necessary to go through, say, 6 or 7 different companies. So as a result of combining all of these companies, they said, we'll call it Western Union. In this area, we have some very, very early commercial equipment. This is the type of equipment one would find on board a ship, time of World War I. These are spark transmitters, the receivers. You could also find this equipment, of course, on a shore station. Now, let's go down a little further here. As you can see, obviously, these are microphones. I may not have mentioned to you, Chuck, but the association really has 2 museums, the old and the new. Now, in our old museum, we have a very large collection of broadcast mics, and some of them are very historical. This microphone right here, for an example. This is one of the very first condenser microphones. I wouldn't be surprised if it weighed, 10, 15 pounds. Condenser microphone today, just a matter of a few ounces. This here, of course, is a very popular microphone of the 1930s. It's a velocity mic. And of course, you look at these microphones, you immediately think of the famous radio personalities of the period. Amos and Andy, later on, of course, Lowell Thomas and others. But Chuck, we're in the upper area of our museum, and this is the amateur section. As you know, most of us are radio amateurs, so we have this whole area devoted strictly to amateur equipment. And what we've tried to do here is to show the development of amateur radio in somewhat of a chronological order. And, of course, your very early radio, or wireless as it was called then, was spark. Spark transmitters. And these then, of course, are spark coils, spark gaps, and related equipment.
I see an interesting piece of equipment here. It doesn't look like a transmitting element.
No, that really doesn't belong there. It's not really an amateur piece of equipment. Believe it or not, Chuck, that is a capacitor. In fact, I don't think I'd be too far off by saying this is the first commercial capacitor or condenser ever made.
Looks like a jar.
Well, it's exactly what it is. They called it a Leyden jar. They developed it over in Leyden, Holland. And the outside is copper, and the inside is copper, and the glass, of course, is the dielectric.
Very simple capacitor.
Yeah, that's the very first of all the capacitors. That dates back, by the way, to about 1902, 1903. What we've tried to do here is to show amateur radio through a period of years. This section through here is 1908, 1910. Over here is 1911, 1912. Now, I might add, all of this equipment is operable, only in the sense that we can turn it on. There's no antennas. Spark became illegal in 1921, 1922. And I'd like to show or demonstrate one of these spark transmitters, and I'll tell you a little about it.
Let's look over your shoulder.
Yes. Okay, now you can see what happens. Now, there's a spark. A spark makes a radio signal. Well, the best example of that, I think, would be lightning. Now, when you have a flash of lightning, you certainly can hear it in a radio receiver. Lightning, of course, is a great big spark. It's very broad. You can hear lightning anywhere on the radio dial, right across the entire spectrum.
You certainly can.
So, of course, here we wanted to confine it into one frequency or wavelength. So we have coils, and we narrow it down. Actually, these coils are tuned around 200 meters. In the early days, the amateur operator ran right around the broadcast band. Now, as I say, we have this somewhat in order by years. That was 1912, 1914. Now we're jumping up to about 1916, 1917. We wanted a little better spark. That sounded rather, well, like a power leak, if you know what a power leak is on a line. This gadget here is a much better spark device. We have a rotating wheel, and again, it'll generate a spark between the spokes of the wheel, and it sounds much, much better. Now, let me demonstrate to you. How do you like that?
I bet you I know now where the nickname Sparky came from for radio operators.
That's very true. Very true. But that's the way it was right up until about 1921-22. But I'd like to show you another spark transmitter. I want to show you the ultimate. Now, here we have the ultimate in an amateur spark transmitter. Like I said just a moment ago, these were banned in 1921, 1922. And I think you'll find out why in just a moment. This is a 1,000 watt sync rotary spark set. Now what I am going to do, I'm going to adjust the position of the gap to the 60 cycles. And that gives us the maximum transfer of power. It's a very powerful thing, and I don't know what it's going to do to your television screen, but let's find out. I have to put these earphones on because I get right down there. It makes a lot of noise. Rather a noisy thing, wasn't it? Well, that's the way it was.
Well, Bruce, thank you very, very much for the tour. It's been very enlightening. I certainly hope we have an opportunity of coming back and seeing more of the museum.
It's been fun. It's been nice to show you around. And believe me, Chuck, you haven't seen everything. But look, come again, invite your friends. You're always welcome.
Thank you. We certainly will come back.
Bye now.
Goodbye. The Harris Corporation, RF Communications Division, wishes to thank the Antique Wireless Association, and especially the museum curator, Bruce Kelley, for their kind assistance on this project. The Antique Wireless Association is a non-profit incorporated organization. Further information may be obtained by writing the Antique Wireless Association in Holcomb, New York, 14469.